Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. So with the title update 10 PTS phase 2, we've seen that, status effects have basically been nerfed. This is something that a lot of people are basically having a discussion over right now. And I think this is why a lot of people basically say things like Massive doesn't really understand their game. That critique is fair because things like this, and none of this has made it into the game by any means, folks. So, we're just talking about these things, but it feels like, the perspective within which the developers look at the game compared to the perspective within which the players look at the game is too differing and very, in my opinion, quite different. So it seems like the developers do these things and players can't help but say that they're out of touch. So I think there's a conversation that went on Reddit, and I have basically a screenshot for you guys here. Somebody here with Massive apparently said, I've definitely seen that the phase 2 status changes have been a staggeringly negative impact. I've had a staggeringly negative impact on the CC damaged builds to the point of bleed burns setups basically no longer being a viable option in Heroic Plus, which, yes, reduces overall build possibilities in Heroic content and ruins the fun for those builds. This also makes a hard cutoff for bleed burn builds challenging since they'll take a huge hit the moment they bump up to Heroic. However, from what I've seen, the pure CC status builds that focus on disorient, blind, etc. aren't as impacted at the higher end. Optimized control builds shouldn't be as impacted by this change as damage builds or mid-quality control builds. Again, all this is based on what's been shared with me so far. That's not to say that the change is perfect, but it might be a step in a positive direction to make Heroic Plus more demanding of higher quality builds and more coordinated communication among groups. We'll have to continue to see how the different status effect builds are impacted by the changes. Now, the one thing I want to say about this is, yes, you want higher coordination, and I can understand that, but honestly, the solo player is who's going to get the burnt of all of this. Now, why am I saying so? Well, remember, guys, I tested this same basic kind of build in the phase 1 of the PTS, and I did test it as a solo player. The aspect of fun when you get to endgame is that you are very powerful. If they really want this PTS to be about increasing the player power, then they have to increase the player power and not necessarily be too afraid about that. Or they can keep the increase in player power to be something that they actually roll out as, time goes on. But first rollout phase, I think that's wise for them to do, is to do the weapon damage increase. That makes a lot of sense. And then once our builds start to interact with the raid, then we'll see exactly how it is. I think what's happening now is they're looking at legendary content basically getting its lunch eaten, and 22-minute runs being the average, or I think one of the best times, and they don't want that to be happening anymore in legendary. So what do? They go ahead and increase the enemy resistance to blind and disorient builds. Well, the Black Tusk are more susceptible to blind and disorient builds, because if you try to use the other status effects on them, like burn and bleed, they don't really they'll run into a support station and they'll be fine. So that's basically why players have actually leaned towards those builds. But this developer is saying that it seems like that the disorient and blind builds don't seem to be taking a hit, but they're taking this hit out on the bleed and the burn, which are the other status effects within the game. So basically, they are actually tweaking the wrong values, because the enemy type that's prevalent in the legendary missions are of an enemy type that can basically do away with the other kinds of status effects. They can zoom across the screen while they're burning. So even if you have a status effect build that's designed to burst them down and gain a benefit while they're under the status effect, they'll fly across the screen and go sit in a support station or hide somewhere, and you won't be able to take them out. So I think largely the developers have a very different or stark understanding of their game if this is the perception that they have. My take is keep the fun aspect in the game. It's a very hard task to do with thinking about PvP and PvE, but then you also have to look at the effect that this has on a series of builds. Now, what's really interesting is if you look at the replies to that comment, somebody said that, this is basically going to affect a whole lot of existing things that uses, status effect and uses, that status damage players use. Trauma, Pyromaniac, Eyeless, fire skills, all the fire stuff. Like I said, I'm a fire and bleed kind of guy. Ongoing directive, Imperial Dynasty exotic, and the coming changes to the BTSU gloves. So in reality, increasing it that way doesn't really make any sense, because there is the aspect of fun that goes into the game, and you have to trust your endgame players to enjoy the game by the time they've reached there, and even provide for your early game players to aspire to reach that kind of power level. I think this is a two-way street. If your early game players are trying to make a build to engage in endgame content, they can always look forward and say, I'm going to get that powerful once I get there. Whereas your endgame players who have already achieved that need to feel comfortable at every patch that comes out. Maybe slight changes here and there, but they need to be feeling that power creep. Now, if you want to increase the power creep and then also kind of maybe in a weird inversely proportional way, also increase the enemy NPC resistance, then that makes sense. So the 40% resistance that was given to enemies in the in the legendary missions, and the 25% resistance, to me is not inversely proportional to the player's own advantage. Instead, it seems a little inversely proportional to the NPC advantage. And when I say inversely proportional, meaning as we get more powerful, the enemy NPCs need to also be able to resist us, but not in a way where they resist us where they're now more powerful than we are. Because if you look at all the other factors that are there, they also deal basically the same amount of damage. They're not going to take it easy on you. They have all kinds of different things that work to their favor, and they, in a way, are more powerful than you, and the content remains unforgiving. So these different factors need to be put into place other than the numbers. And I understand our developers are more numbers people, but when they look at the fact that heroic is already unforgiving and legendary is already unforgiving, in the sense that once you die, it's already a wipe and a refresh, then they probably need to go back to these numbers and say, okay, what we have here makes the player feel strong, but also the enemy NPC has a lot of things that work in their favor, and we probably need to keep this area of the strength for gamers. Because sure, you put that there were many arguments made on Reddit, which is probably, in my opinion, a very sound way to put these discussions is, if you put those builds in players that don't really know how to play in their hands, that don't have the experience, that don't have the awareness, yes, they will still fail. These are, this Reddit thread, as much as I will never ever recommend a Reddit thread because I'm not a fan of the Division 2's Reddit, many of you may not know, but I go there once in a while to look at some things. This is the one thread I would say you probably need to look at in the first few responses. It made a lot of sense. You got to account for fun in the game. I know you want to make heroic challenging, but heroic is already unforgiving. Is that not in itself one challenge that you can say, okay, players can actually say, okay, you already have this one stacked up challenge against you, and then NPC power, things like leagues, things like timed runs, all the other things that will factor in, it doesn't make a good case for this nerf to status effects. I don't think this is the way it should go, because there are, one, builds that will follow. These points have already been made. I don't need to sit here repeating myself. I feel like the developers need to go back and say, okay, what is the number that will be better? And it is not that 40% in heroic, nor is it 40% in legendary, nor 25% in heroic. I think instead those numbers need to be tuned down by at least 9 to 10%, so that our builds are still viable and the content still remains challenging, but it's not disheartening and not fun at the same time. That's basically what I wanted to say today in this video. I guess I'll talk to you all soon. Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section. We need to keep this conversation going so that they don't go release a patch that is not fun. Sure, the patch may be new and fresh, but it's gonna get stale real quick when you as an endgame player can't feel powerful. All right, I'll get out of your hair. Peace.